Hey, it's Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader, and welcome to the Black Belt Leadership Podcast, where each week I'm giving you tips, tools, insights, and resources to help you become a better version of who you are and what you do as you discover, develop, and deploy your own Black Belt Leader within. Hey, this week I want to go back in history and I want to talk about the Battle of Champions as I take on the topic, facing your giant. Now, if you're a person of faith, you're probably familiar with the story of David and Goliath. And even if you're not a person of faith, you probably know the story. But just in case you don't, let me share the story of David and Goliath and set up the battle of champions. Now, in the book of Samuel, we read the story of a teenage shepherd. His name was David, and David goes at his parents' bequest to visit his brothers who's serving in the military. He's there to take them some provisions from home to make sure that they're doing okay and to be able to report back to mom and dad that the brothers are okay. Now, David arrives at the campment, and as he's there, he notices that all of the soldiers are standing around and nobody's engaging in battle. He doesn't understand what's going on, and he just begins to interact with the soldiers and ask them how the battle is going. David detects a sense of fear running through the entire camp. And then all of a sudden, David witnesses an enemy soldier by the name of Goliath. This giant of a man steps out from the opposing enemy's ranks and he begins to curse the soldiers. He begins to curse the king. He begins to curse their God, and he begins to issue a challenge for one-on-one combat, a battle of champions. Now, in this time in history, many military conflicts were settled by what was known as the Battle of Champions. Rather than engage in a prolonged battle where many lives would be lost, each opposing army, if there wasn't a quick and decisive victory by one side or the other, and they settled into essentially today what we would call trench warfare, each opposing army would choose to select a representative from their ranks, an individual that they would call a champion. And that champion would represent that entire army in one-on-one combat facing the champion from the opposing military forces. This was mano a mano, man to man, one-on-one combat, what we refer today as Mortal Kombat. Now, the army whose champion was victorious was deemed the victor of the entire battle, as if both sides had fought a war. So if you're a movie buff, you probably saw this displayed in the movie Troy. In the opening scene of the movie, we see Brad Pitt playing the character of Achilles. He comes onto the scene as two armies are standing faced off, opposing, and in front of the opposing army is this giant of a man named Boagrius. And Boagrius is shouting and screaming and yelling, demanding that one of the soldiers from the opposing side, of which Achilles represented, would come forward to battle him in one-on-one combat. He knew, based upon his size and his strength and his experience, looking at the soldiers on the other side, this was going to be an easy win. And then Achilles shows up. He is sent out by the king as the champion, and immediately the battle begins. Boagrius begins to throw spears, which Achilles dodges, and he rushes forward. And as he rushes forward, he draws his sword. He leaps into the air, and with a single thrust of the sword, he goes down through the shoulder and into the heart of the adversary in a stabbing motion, almost undetectable, instantly killing his opponent. Boagrius takes a 2 steps forward and then drops to the ground, dead. Now, later in the same movie, Troy, we see Achilles face off with the champion of Troy, Hector. Hector was the most skilled warrior in all of Troy, and the city had been sealed up and was being sieged by Achilles and the opposing army of Agamemnon, and they had been fighting, and it was essentially a stalemate. So to bring the stalemate to a conclusion, they declared a winner-take-all battle royale, battle of champions. Hector versus Achilles. Now, despite the fact that Hector was a very skilled warrior, he was eventually outmatched. Achilles had superior strength, and if we believe the story to be true, he had the divine favor of the gods. So the Trojans lost their greatest defender, and ultimately they ended up losing their entire city. Now, back to the story of David and Goliath. Day after day, while David was visiting camp, this young shepherd heard these guttural threats and these obscenities being shouted by Goliath, challenging again and again one soldier to step forward and engage with him in combat. And the more he bellowed and the more he blustered, the more the army of Israel began to quake in fear. David observed how this ongoing challenging threat struck fear into the lives of the soldiers. Now, these giants' words so angered this young shepherd boy that he'd finally had enough. David got permission to go to the king, and David, a young teenage shepherd boy, offered to fight this enemy soldier in combat. Now, think about that for a minute and try to envision that in your mind. You're the king of the Israeli army, and you're standing in battle facing an opposing army from Philistia. You guys have been fighting back and forth, and nobody's been able to gain an edge. And all of a sudden, one of the most veteran of their military soldiers steps forward and wants to have a battle royale, battle of champions. And here stands a small, of stature, probably a little bit skinny, shepherd boy with no military experience. So you can imagine the mockery that took place, and maybe the snickers and the smirks, and maybe a few comments back and forth, and the king asking why he would send out a young, inexperienced shepherd to fight a veteran soldier. So David began to share with the king that as a shepherd, he had military experience. He had successfully slain a lion and a bear in one-on-one combat. David shared with the king how that a lion and at a separate time a bear had ventured into the pasture where David was watching the sheep, and they had attempted to take sheep from the flock. So David had engaged in mortal combat with a lion and with a bear and had successfully slain both of these foes. And then David boldly proclaimed to the king that the God who had delivered him from the lion and the bear would deliver him from the hands of the giant Goliath. So eventually the king subsided. So David was offered the king's armor, but he refused it. He chose instead to fight in attire that was comfortable to him, the clothes of a shepherd. He also refused the king's weapons. He chose instead to rely on a trusted slingshot, which was one of the preferred weapons of the shepherd, that and the staff. And then as David made his way from the camp towards the place where this battle would take place, and he was going to confront Goliath as an enemy combatant, David paused at a small brook, and he picked up 5 smooth stones, and he put them in a small bag attached to a belt at his waist. And then David walked out onto the field of combat to face this veteran soldier. Now, again, I want you to picture this in your mind's eye. Can you imagine a veteran soldier, the hero of many, many such battles throughout history, watching as a young teenager, not dressed in armor, but dressed in the simple attire of a shepherd, walking out onto the field of battle to face this veteran champion of military conquest? You know, I can imagine that Goliath began to mock the opposing army of Israel. He began to ask them, why in the world would you send a child to do a man's job? I can see the opposing army of Philistia also begin to mock and to jeer and have an opportunity to make fun of David, to make fun of the Israeli army, and to really look forward to the bloodbath that was about to take place as their champion devastated this young teenage boy. Well, David ignored the mockery. He ignored the snickers. He ignored the laughter, and his response to Goliath was powerful. David looked at this giant of a man, and he shared with him the same story that he shared with the king. He said, Goliath, I have faced the lion, and I have faced the bear in one-on-one combat. And in each one of those scenarios, I have walked away victorious. And the same God that enabled me to kill the lion and to kill the bear is going to give me victory over you this day, and I will hoist your head in victory. Now, again, can you imagine the humor that Goliath and the soldiers that were looking on displayed as they listened to the taunting of this young teenage boy, threatening a veteran soldier that he was going to behead this soldier when all he held in his hand was a slingshot. Think about that in terms of a mano moment. You know, as I try to envision this in my mind's eye, I can see the smirks, I can hear the laughter, and I can hear the continued mocking taunts. But what was missed and what Goliath and the enemy soldier should have paid attention to was David's demeanor. David wasn't smiling. David wasn't laughing. David was deadly serious. And that to Goliath should have been a clue that something special was about to happen. So here we are, two warriors about to face off, both armies watching from the distance. And think about what's about to happen. Soldier facing shepherd. And they stood in this designated area where they were going to fight one-on-one until only one remained alive. Mortal combat, lives in the balance, and the opportunity to have bragging rights and a military victory stood squarely on the shoulders of the soldier and the shepherd. So David took the initiative. He began to engage in battle with this massive opponent. Now, let me give you a little bit of backstory on Goliath. If you go and read the historical account of this story, the story puts Goliath's height at roughly 9 foot, 9 inches tall. This was literally a giant of a man. Now, think about that, 9 foot 9 facing a young teenage boy. It was truly a battle of a giant versus a dwarf. Goliath stood clad in battle armor, chain mail from head to toe, leaving very few openings to be exploited in battle. Now, the narrative also says that Goliath wielded a spear, that the head of the spear made of iron itself weighed between 12 and 26 pounds. It describes the spear as more like a beam that you would use to gird and hold up a house. Now, the narrative also says that Goliath carried a massive sword as a secondary weapon. Now, think about that. 9 feet 9, clad in armor, a massive spear, and a large, sharp sword. And here stood David on the other side of this area where they had been designated to fight, wearing the simple clothes of a shepherd, and his only weapon, a slingshot and 5 smooth stones. Well, David engaged, but he engaged from a distance. David knew that if he got close, it would give Goliath a tactical advantage because he was used to close quarters combat. That's how war was fought back then. So David kept his distance, and as he began to circle and look for an opening, he took one of the small stones from the bag in his pocket, and he placed it in his sling, and he began to swing that sling in a circular motion, building up speed and momentum. And at just the right moment, when Goliath turned and faced the exact right direction, David released the stone, and it hurled through the air like a bullet. The story tells us that the stone struck Goliath in the forehead in an area that was not protected by his armor, and the striking of that blow with that stone hit with such force that the stone itself shattered the forehead and sank into the brain matter of this giant. Now, you can imagine if he wasn't dead, he was stunned in that moment, and the Goliath, the giant, fell to the ground. So David immediately rushes forward and he draws Goliath's own sword, and he uses it just as he declared he would do to decapitate his foe. And then as David hoists the head of the fallen enemy in the air, he signaled victory in the contest of champions. You can imagine at that moment, the army of Israel erupted into celebration, and the opposing army of Philistia was shocked in awe. Seeing their champion defeated, the story ends by telling us that the enemy army retreated in fear. So what's the moral of the story, and where are we going with this story today? David accomplished what an army of trained soldiers were unwilling to do. David faced his giant, and he conquered him. While the soldiers were thinking too small, focusing on what they couldn't do, David was thinking big. David was focused on what he knew he was capable of doing. Now, my good friend Chris Robinson, a speaker and an author and an incredible individual, you've heard me share this quote before, but Chris says it well, and it's apropos right here. He says, "It's not that you can't, it's that you won't, and that choice is yours." Now, think about that in terms of the story that we just heard. In this story, David chose to do what he could. David was focused on what he could do and would do. The soldiers instead were focused on what they couldn't do and wouldn't do. Each made a choice. One choice held them back from victory, but the choice of the young shepherd boy led to victory and to success. David was thinking big when everybody around him was thinking small. And in case you haven't figured it out yet, this is a lesson in thinking. Now, one of my favorite books is Dave Schwartz's classic, The Magic of Thinking Big. And if you've not read the book, I encourage you to get it. I looked today and it's still available on Amazon, despite the fact that it is an old classic. And it's now also available not only in print, but as an audiobook as well. Now, the premise of the book is simple, but it's profound. And let me give you the premise of the book. And here's basically what it says. For most of us, it's not that we think too big, it's that we think too small and we're okay with it. Now, let me say that again. It's not that you think too big, it's that you think too small and you're okay with it. You know, I love this quote from the book that really reinforces this premise. Here's what is said in the book as David shares some brilliant truths about belief. He says, those who believe they can move mountains do, and those who believe they can't, cannot. Belief triggers the power to do. Now, think about what David Schwartz just said. It's not that you can't, it's that you won't, and that choice is yours. David said it this way, those who believe they can move mountains, those who believe they can, they do. And those who believe they can't, cannot. Belief triggers the power to do. Now, those quotes remind me of a very simple truth, and that simple truth is this. When we're okay with thinking too small and believing that too small is big enough, we limit our success. Now, I'm talking about a limitation. A limitation is a self-imposed roadblock. It's a self-imposed impediment. It's like pouring a case of broken glass all over a trail that we're going to walk and then taking off our shoes and socks and trying to walk that trail barefoot. Or it's like identifying the road to success and then erecting a series of barriers that prevent us from taking a single step to walk down the road. In either scenario, at best, the going's going to be slow, but more likely, we're not even going to be able to go at all because the barriers and the limitations hold us back. Now, Henry Ford, the brilliant inventor of the automobile, famously said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Now, that simply reinforces what we heard from Chris Robinson, what we heard from David Schwartz. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. As a man thinketh, so is he. That's what we read from James Allen's classic book, as well as a truth from the words of King Solomon. I like to say it this way. As you think, you say, you do, and become. Now, think about that. As you think, you become. And if you think small, you become small. If you think limiting thoughts, you become a limited person. But if you think limitless thoughts, you become a limitless person. That's why thinking is so important in our lives. That's why you got to face your giant. Now, there's a lot of truth in what I've shared up to this point, but here's something I want to point out. Far too many people choose to focus on the latter rather than the former. They choose to focus on what they can't do rather than what they can't. And if as we think, we say, we do, and become, when we think small, we end up saying small things. When we think small, we end up doing small things. And when we think small, we end up becoming a small person. Because if we're willing to settle for less, less is all we're ever going to attract. Think about that. If we're willing to settle for less, less is all we're ever going to attract. Now, what I'm talking about is how you define enough. Now, if we go to the dictionary, by definition, enough is having as much or as many as required. Now, that could be whatever thing you need, but enough is having as much or as many as is required. So the key word there I want to lean in on is required. If we only require a little, if we only require a small amount, then guess what? Enough becomes enough way too soon. So our definition of success is going to be defined by our definition of enough. If we only require a little, if we only require a small amount, enough becomes enough too soon. Our definition of enough is either going to expand or limit our success. Now, when I'm talking about enough and I'm talking about limiting by your enough, what am I talking about? When it comes to success, when is it high enough? When is it far enough? When is it long enough? When is it wide enough? When is it deep enough? When have we worked enough? When is it hard enough? When do we know enough? When have we done enough? When have we said enough, learned enough, grown enough, matured enough, won enough, and been successful enough or gotten ahead of enough that we are okay with that being enough? That is where we define what success looks like for us and whether we limit our success or we choose not to. Because the minute we settle for enough, I've gone high enough, I've gone far enough, I've gone long enough, I'm not going to go through all of those again, but when we settle for enough, we stop striving for success. And when settling for what is good enough, then good enough becomes good enough. And when good enough is good enough, greatness only becomes what's good enough. When good enough is good enough, we limit what greatness looks like to us. So if you want to be successful, again, you got to face your giant. Now, I'm not talking about Goliath, but yes, I am. I'm talking about your own Goliath. But your Goliath is not known as Goliath. This giant is known by many names, and they are names of your choosing. Some of the names that you may call your giant, and this may take you by surprise when I share this, but this is what you named your giant. Not smart enough, not good enough, not talented enough, not tough enough, not wise enough, not experienced enough, not educated enough, not handsome enough, not pretty enough, not tall enough, not short enough, not old enough, not young enough, not strong enough, not skilled enough. I could keep going, but I think you get it. What we say to ourselves that limits us is the name we've given our giant. In reality, I want you to get this. This giant is a construct of our thinking. It is a creature of our belief system. And what is sad is that far too many of us create and name our own giant by the words we say to ourselves and the thoughts we think about ourselves. We self-manufacture the character that we call our giant. And by the names we call our giant, by the things we think about our giant, and repeat those over and over, amplifying what we believe to be true, we make that self-manufactured character appear larger than he truly is. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves staring down a giant of doubt and disbelief and not enough. Now, other times, the giant is not just a construct of our thinking, it's a construct of the thinking of others. It becomes a creature not just of our belief system, but of the belief system of other people. How does that happen? When we allow the opinions of other people to create and name our giants, and then we accept their beliefs of our limits as our own limiting beliefs, we have now allowed them to create and name our giant, and we have adopted it as our own. So either way, whether we've created it ourselves or we've allowed others to create it and we've adopted it, or it's a combination of the two, at the end of the day, it is a giant that you and I have got to stare down, we've got to take on, and we've got to conquer it. We've got to slay our giant if we want to experience the greatness that we were put on this earth to accomplish. You and I have got to engage in a one-on-one battle with the giant of doubt and disbelief and not enough. And here's what I'm going to tell you. There can only be one champion, and that champion needs to be you. So small thinking, like a Goliath, doesn't want you to succeed. Think about that. Small thinking doesn't want you to succeed. It doesn't want you to rise to your full potential, and it doesn't want you to prove to yourself and the world around you that you were born for greatness. So it's up to you to prove that giant wrong, to conquer that giant, and to stand holding the head of that giant high in the air and showing those limiting voices around you and inside your head that you were born for more. Because when you conquer your giant, you're going to change your thinking, you're going to change your belief of yourselves, and when those two things happen, you're going to change your world. Now, I want you to pause and I want you to think for a moment. What would the world look like if the following individuals had chosen to be okay with small thinking? If they had chosen to create their own giant of doubt and disbelief and not enough, or they had chosen to accept the limitations other people wanted to put on many of them, what would the world look like today? What would the world look like if Thomas Edison hadn't stepped into the greatness of who he was? What about Henry Ford, Joseph Salk, Alexander Graham Bell? What about the Wright brothers? What about Bill Gates? What about Stephen Jobs or Michael Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, just to name a few? What if they had chosen to be okay with small thinking? What would the world look like? We'd have no lights, no movies, no copy machines, no video recorders, no automobiles, no vaccines, no telephone, no airplanes, no Windows operating system, no iPhone, no iPad, no Facebook, no Tesla, no SpaceX. Many of the inventions that we enjoy today as commonplace came from the brilliance of these men who stepped into their greatness. Now, these men and countless other men and women just like them, they chose to face their giant. They chose to conquer the limitations other people tried to put on their lives, and they chose to also silence the self-imposed limitations of that nagging little voice in their head trying to tell them that they were not enough, and the limiting things other people were saying about them were true when they were not. Like David, these men and countless others chose to be defined, hear me, by what they could do and what they could become, and their could do and could become became their would do and would become. And their would do and their would become is what drove those individuals to their lofty success. Because they believed that they could do it, and because they could do it, they would do it, and because they believed they could and they would, they did. Og Mandino sums it up well in his book, The Greatest Salesman in the World, I Will Persist Until I Succeed. Now, in the book, The Magic of Thinking Big, David Schwartz shares 3 powerful insights, and these 3 insights will help you stop thinking small and start thinking big. Let me give you a quick summary, but again, I want to encourage you, if you don't have it, get the book. It is a must read and a must have for your personal growth library. So, from The Magic of Thinking Big, tip number 1, focus on success, not failure. You got to remember that what we focus on expands in our thinking, and our outlook determines our outcome. Remember what Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. So when you focus on success and you believe you're going to be successful, you're going to see what you can do rather than what you can't. But if you're focused on failure, what you're going to see is what you can't do, and ultimately what you can't do, you won't do, and you end up stuck where you are, as you are, and your life remains unchanged. Now, the second thing we've got to do is we've got to remind ourselves that we're better than we think we are. All too times, we have a limit of how successful we believe we can come. We undervalue our potential way, way too often. So successful people have got to stare down the giant of mediocrity. And they've got to believe that they are capable of saying, doing, and becoming more. Because that's what black belt leaders do. They discover, develop, and deploy their own black belt leader within so they can live their life with black belt excellence and step into the greatness that they were put on this earth to accomplish. So what am I saying here? You've got to stare down the giant of mediocrity. You got to believe in what you're capable of saying, doing, and becoming, and then act on that belief. You've got to say more, you've got to do more, and you've got to become more. And that happens when you take the action steps necessary to bring that belief into its physical manifestation in the earth. Now, the third thing you've got to do is you've got to believe big and you've got to act accordingly. Remember, the size of your success is going to be determined by the size of your belief in yourself, going back to the second point I just shared. So when you think little thoughts, guess what you're going to get? Little outcomes. When you think bigger thoughts, you're going to get bigger outcomes. And when you think bold, hairy, audacious thoughts, you're going to get these incredibly successful outcomes that are going to put you on the path for stepping into the greatness of what you've been put on this earth to accomplish. Now, Albert Einstein made a brilliant observation, and as I get ready to wrap up, I want to share some interesting observations from Albert Einstein. He said this: the world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. So I want you to pause for a moment and I want you to think about the world as you have created it, your world that you live in right now. I'm talking about the way you think, what you believe, and how your thoughts and your belief shape your actions that have become the habits and how you live your life. The world that you have created up to this point has been a process of your thinking. Now, you've heard me say many, many times on this podcast that you and I cannot outperform the quality of thinking that we bring to any endeavor. So if we want to achieve a better outcome, we've got to improve the quality of our thinking. It's exactly what Einstein is saying right here. If the world we've created is a process of our thinking, we cannot change it for the better or the worse without changing our thinking. So the challenge for you and the challenge for me is what? We've got to change our thinking for the better if we want to experience better outcomes in life. So if you want to be a black belt leader in life, here's what I'm here to tell you. Facing the giant of doubt, of disbelief, and of not enough isn't an option. Like David in the story I opened with today, you and I have got to be willing to respond to this bellowing monster. We've got to see him for the imposter that he is, and we've got to step up with a sling in our hand, and we've got to conquer this foe. Because when we do that, when we face our giant and we defeat our giant, what do? We remove the self-imposed roadblocks standing in our way. We also remove the others' imposed limitations that are holding us back. So here's my challenge as I get ready to wrap up this week's teaching. And I want to leave you with this very simple thought. I want you to grab your slingshot. I want you to pick up your stones, and I want you to go out and face your giant and challenge your giant and take out that giant standing in your way. And when you're fighting a giant, don't forget the old adage, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. I'm Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.